So we're going to bring up our first strategy group and our first strategy group. It's being moderated by Ms. Alicia Wilson, the VP of Economic Development for Johns Hopkins University. Also, she'll be joined by Ms. Allison Perkins Cohen, the Chief of Staff of Baltimore City Public Schools, and Mr. Josh Sharfstein, Vice Dean of Public Health from Bloomberg. Good?
Moderate from here?
You can moderate from here, you can moderate from there, whatever one. All right. So let's welcome them.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Alicia Wilson, Vice President for Economic Development, and I can't tell you how excited I was to get to moderate this panel. These are two rock stars you're going to see in a minute to talk about this topic of school infrastructure. Don't worry, allergies. I wanted to start by talking about school infrastructure, actually with a story, if Dr. Santelises don't mind telling a little story. Okay, so I recall probably about 8 or 9 years ago, seeing a news report with the young people sitting in classrooms with coats on. You remember that school report? I remember it. And when that occurred, I was actually working for a developer, so building buildings and thinking about infrastructure and thinking about those things for private buildings. And something moved my heart one night. And I knew that she was having to respond to these children being in coats in buildings. But I also, because of my vantage point, was able to see the advocacy that she was doing in Annapolis to change the systemic issues that necessitated those children being in coats. And I remember her being so open arms about solutions to dealing with the day-to-day as well as the systemic. And I think that's what we're talking about here today. School infrastructure, understanding the unfairness of the immediacy and realizing systemic work has to take place. And so the work and the research that Dr. Sharfstein and the great work that Allison Perkins Cohen get to do on a day-to-day basis is about the immediate as well as the long term. And I think it is about the genius of the and. And so as we talk about the conversation on school infrastructure, and let me say this, let me pause and thank Dr. Santelises for taking that call and also being willing to do what is right in front of our face, but also think about the systemic because of all the great school buildings that are coming online, but realizing we have more work to do. So just thank you for your leadership. And with that, I'm going to get to turn it over to two amazing individuals who get to wake up every day thinking about these topics. And then we're going to give an opportunity for you all to engage in this conversation. So we're not going to be alone up here. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Josh Sharfstein. Dr. Sharfstein, I'm not going to go his real bio. He is the guru. He is someone that I would say is in everything that is good that's going on in this country and has been a great ally and support in so many great work. So his work on school infrastructure is extremely exciting. And then I'm going to turn it over to Allison Perkins Cohen to talk a little bit about Baltimore City. But with that, Josh.
Thank you very much. You guys hear me okay? There we go. And thank you for reading the introduction provided by my mother. I just want to, first of all, take up from what Alicia said, that bringing together the immediate and the strategic and the long term, I think nobody asked me, and this meeting is a great project to bring different things together. Academic researchers and terrific policymakers. We have Allison on the panel, and you heard from Dr. Santelises and Tina. And also, bringing together the experiences of young people and their families in Baltimore with data and information about what the big picture is. So what we're going to do in this panel is I'm going to share some results that have never been presented publicly before. This is the first time, about some work about the conditions of schools in Baltimore, in particular in comparison to other places in the state. And then we'll turn to Allison, who will talk about the perspective of Baltimore City Schools. And I want to just start by particularly thanking Baltimore City Schools for very much supporting this work from the very, very beginning. All right, here we go. Buckle your seatbelts, because I have a lot of slides, but I'm going to just try to just follow the red bar. That's my one piece of advice, to watch where Baltimore is compared to other places. Okay, before we get started, I want to tell you why I'm involved in this. This is a graph that I did not make. This is a graph that comes out of the state agency responsible for school construction. And you don't have to know anything about this graph except for the fact that Baltimore is above average in school conditions. Now that is a head scratcher to anyone who has had kids in Baltimore City School, is a kid in Baltimore City School, has walked past the Baltimore City School, has clicked on any website about Baltimore City Schools. That's very confusing that Baltimore would be above average. So how is that possible? That's what kind of drew us in. And as we came into this, we realized just how fundamentally misleading this was. And so we had two questions. How do the physical conditions of schools, public schools in Baltimore City, compare to those elsewhere in the state? And if there are systematic differences, why do they exist? So let's do the first one. And I'm going to go through different data sources. So the way we think in public health, and I work at the public health school, so there isn't one perfect data source for anything. You're trying to understand something by looking from different angles. So the team that I work with, we tried to find every little scrap of data we could, and I'm going to show you this question, this fundamental question: how do the conditions in Baltimore City schools compare to other counties from multiple angles? We're just going to start with the age. Now, if you look at the average age of a school, Baltimore City is the third oldest in the state, okay? And you can see the red bar there. But that's the average age. There's another way of thinking about age, which is where are all the extra years accumulated? Because we have a lot of schools, and say Kent County doesn't have that many. So where are the extra years accumulated? If you look at that, you can see that 75% of the years past average are just in two counties in the state: Prince George's County, which is the oldest, and Baltimore City. And you don't have to be a health equity scholar to figure out what's different about Baltimore City and Prince George's County. 75% of the extra ages are in those two counties. So it's a different way of looking at it, but if you drove around the state to find where the old schools are, you'd be spending a lot of time in Baltimore City and Prince George's County. Okay, that's one. Let's just look, for example, at the, actually we're not going to do that one, we're going to look at the age of the roof. If you look at the roof age, more than 25 years, Baltimore City's roof has more than 30 schools with a roof over 25 years old, far more than any other county in the state. So just zeroing in on roofs, for example, in addition to the overall age. Now I want to introduce another concept called replacement value. And the state of Maryland did an assessment. They went around to every single school with a clipboard, and they looked at the stuff that is in the schools, and they asked, how much would it cost to replace this stuff? Replacement value is that concept. And so if there was like a particular piece of equipment that wasn't that expensive, think of that as kind of like a Pinto. If there was the same piece of equipment in another school that was more expensive, think of that like a Cadillac. So replacement value sort of reflects the stuff that's there. Is it nicer or is it cheaper? Okay? It reflects the value of the system's components if replaced. Interestingly, Baltimore City has the lowest replacement value per square foot. And again, this is just something we just started looking at to understand. This, again, is average. Now, what if you look at the cumulative replacement value deficit? Baltimore City is almost completely off the map. So if you looked at, the way I did this was imagine if every state had the average replacement value. Every county basically had the same stuff in its schools. Then they would all be around that middle line. Some schools have much more expensive stuff in their schools, and Baltimore City has this enormous gap under what it would otherwise have. That's replacement value. If you just look at air conditioner replacement values, I wanted to pick one roof example, one air conditioner example. You can see Baltimore City has one of the lowest, again, replacement values in the state, representing just sort of the cheapest type of air conditioners. And if you look at the cumulative gap, it's just staggering. I mean, you almost have to get 2 more slide projectors, you know, to see what the gap is if you were going to change the scale. That is a dollar number at the bottom, well into the millions less than it would otherwise have. Okay, everybody with me how I'm doing this? Like lots of different types of information. Follow the red bar if you can. We're going to look at school components past the lifespan. So there's a concept called expected useful lifespan. Like when you get a roof for your house and they say it's a 25-year roof, your expected lifespan is 25 years. Okay, so if you ask, and they looked at every component in every school in Maryland, and they said, how long was it supposed to last when it was bought? And is it past that lifespan? So if you look, so you can compare how much of a school infrastructure is old using replacement value. And this is the replacement value of components 10 years past the lifespan. So if it's a 25-year roof, we're now at 35 years, okay? If you look 10 years past the lifespan, Baltimore City has $520 million worth of replacement value. 10 years past the lifespan, it's number 2 in the state. If you look 20 years past the lifespan, it goes to the top, $273 million, 20 years past the lifespan. 30 years past the lifespan, it is by far the oldest, okay? So just again, different ways of thinking quantitatively about the gaps between Baltimore City and elsewhere. Okay, now we're gonna look at something called the FCI score, another angle on this. The FCI score is not based on the lifespan that when you bought it, like 25 years, it's based on an inspection and people estimating how much more time it has. So maybe it's 35 years into a 25-year expected life, but someone looks at it and goes, I think it has 5 years left, or something like that. That's the FCI score. And just so you know, there's a way of thinking about the FCI score for the entire school, and 60% is a threshold that the state itself adopted. A 60% school basically means that, and this is a direct quote, worn or shabby, suffering from major functionality issues, requiring frequent and costly reactive maintenance work, and is likely to be considered for renewal or replacement. This was the FCI score from that very first slide, which was presented as an average. Very misleading, because Baltimore has some new schools and some old schools, but the right way to ask the question, so it averages out, but the right way to ask the question, if you're looking for where the greatest need is, who has schools that really are in trouble, right, that are 60% plus? And no surprise, Baltimore City first, Prince George's County second. Okay, this would be the right way to show that first graph that I showed you. If you look at just the HVAC, the air conditioner and heating, for 80%, Baltimore City is the top in the state. If you look at the roof, for 80%, Baltimore City is by far the top in the state in terms of the number of schools that have basically very little expected life for their roof. I don't know why this is going so fast here. Okay, now we're going to go to the inspection itself, because the inspectors go out and they look at a school and they say, is this an emergency condition right here? I mean, is this really a serious problem? And they have 3 levels of emergency conditions. They have, this is an immediate emergency, this is pretty bad but not an immediate emergency, and this is still pretty bad but not quite that second level. Okay, so they've got 3 levels that they're going to. I'm going to show you all 3 levels by county. One of them is called immediate life threat, the second one, mitigate additional damage, and the third, degraded. But basically it's just like worst, middle worst, and third worst. This is the worst, okay? Baltimore City has, by far, the most stuff in the highest risk emergency category in the state. If you look at the top 2 categories, Baltimore City, again, by far the most, $39 million worth of emergency replacement items according to the state's own inspectors. And if you look at the top 3, Baltimore is still at the top. you can see how ridiculous it is to say that Baltimore is above average as you're looking at these different dimensions. But we're not done. A few more just to throw out there. Earlier, before the pandemic, we filed a Public Information Act request with the state of Maryland to look at the counties that had to shorten the school year for particular schools, which happens because there are problems in the schools. So this is something that's open to every county. And if you look at the number of days that had to be shortened, Baltimore City had, I think, 40% of the days in the state and was, again, the lead. We also looked at something called the maintenance effectiveness surveys, which are sort of the ability to maintain the schools. And the state of maintenance has a relationship with the underlying school component and school conditions, because it could be that it's very hard to clean something, for example, that's very old. And, so here you see that in terms of maintenance effectiveness, Baltimore City has by far the lowest number of schools in the good or superior range, and one of the lowest, one of the highest in the not adequate or poor range. Here's some excerpts from the reports that inspectors have found, which basically reflect that the conditions have to do with this underlying problem of old or dangerous or problematic materials in the school. Persistent deficiencies appear to result from the lack of capital investments. Improvements in all maintenance categories will depend on the quality and comprehensiveness of capital improvement projects. Other factors may contribute to lower ratings, such as the age of the facility and its components. So this shows that these underlying conditions are affecting the ability to keep the schools in conditions that are conducive to education. I'll just keep going, but basically, of 12 school components designated as poor across the state of Maryland, 8 were in Baltimore City and 4 were in Prince George's County in the most recent survey. This is some work from last year. We were looking, again, before the pandemic, when students were all supposed to be in school, how much school was missed because of problems with school conditions. And we found that there were 1.5 million hours of facility-related missed school in Baltimore City from 2014 to 2019, about 221,000 full-day equivalents affecting students in the school system. Nearly 90% of the losses happened in 2018 and 2019 when there were major failures related to cooling and heating. These were all the different reasons. It included plumbing, gas, fire, electrical, water, flooding, other things like that. And then finally, we have Nobody Asked Me, which is a complementary data source to understand what's going on. And you heard some of the very compelling stories earlier today. And you know all about Nobody Asked Me, so I don't have to put that up here. But basically, there are a whole bunch of student quotes and perspectives that are relevant to really understanding what this meant for them, for their learning environment. One of them, there would be ceilings falling in. Their classes were when it rained, you'd have to put a bucket there. Sometimes when the heater would break in the middle of the day, we'd all just have to bundle up. We'd just leave, bundle up in their jackets and scarves, and literally in class. I think we saw this one. It was a beautiful building that was in disrepair. It was funny at the time. We would joke about it because I guess we didn't know how to handle it any other way. Not having air conditioning, you can't focus when it's 80 degrees. I mean, I sweat a lot, so I'd be sweating in class. It was terrible going to school. So I've been able to get through a lot of data very quickly. I appreciate your bearing with me. I think our conclusions from this first phase of this project are that Baltimore City is particularly disadvantaged in school conditions compared to other counties in Maryland, and the equity gaps are plainly evident from multiple sources, multiple perspectives. These are individual notes, but they kind of sing a song, and the song is of unfairness and deep problems, and evident from multiple sources of data and in the words of young people themselves. Second question, I'll just briefly touch on, if there are systematic differences, and hopefully you agree with me that there are, why do they exist? And this is something we are still looking into. I will share with you that this is what happened in fiscal year 2020 in terms of funding for capital projects in schools. And you can see that Baltimore City got far less than other comparable counties. That is millions of dollars on the axis here. So you can see Baltimore County was close to $300 million to spend on the capital in schools, compared to Baltimore City, which was down in the $50 million range. So we're not talking about small gradations in differences in funding. And this is just 1 year. It's not, if you think about this kind of difference year over year, you get a sense of how you wind up with the other graphs that I showed you. Now, the state share is in blue and the county share is in red. So the state gives about the same to each of these counties, but the county's ability to contribute to the schools is very different. And you see, well, why is that? This next slide shows the tax base by county in millions of dollars. So because the state bases so much of capital spending on the county, and because we have some very wealthy counties that are able to spend $200+ million a year on school constructions, that's one reason why we're seeing this major inequity in school conditions. So preliminary conclusions from this: funding differences may explain the different physical conditions, and they may be due to serious differences in the tax base and the ability of counties to support this. And of course, in Maryland, we have a constitution that doesn't say you have the right to a sufficient education depending on what county you're in. It just says you have a right to a sufficient education. So there's some major constitutional questions for a system that bases the ability to go to a school in good condition on the county that you're in. Further work here includes further investigation of the reasons for differences in the school conditions, including further exploration of some of the historical funding. But also, we're going to be, and we have started to look at how the state is using its assessment to prioritize schools to get fixed with extra state money. And we would like to see that the assessment and the plan is a fair reflection of the data from its assessment. That first slide, though, that I showed you where it said Baltimore City is above average, just means that we have to be sure that the state is following through in the decisions that it will be making over the next couple of years to make sure that it is taking into account these serious equity gaps. And so I want to thank the students that work with me, including one of them is a graduate of Baltimore City Schools, Sheila. I want to thank the school system, as I did before, which has been incredibly helpful to this. I want to thank the Interagency Commission on School Construction, which gave me a lot of the data and helped me understand it, and of course the Nobody Asked Me team. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Perkins Cohen, Chief of Staff for City Schools. So thank you, Josh, for that wonderful presentation. And I am so grateful to be up here with Alicia and Josh, who have both been really up close and personal with all the realities of all the data that Josh just showed. So Josh is, in addition, he didn't tell you, to doing all this analysis, Josh is a parent of 2 graduates of Baltimore City Schools, as am I, and personally experienced what our kids experience every day, which is a lot of that lost time that Josh talked about. We experienced that as parents, where our students were out of school because of the heating conditions at City College, that we could not heat that building, or because it couldn't cool either. And so they missed a lot of instructional time. And this year, Poly, Western, and City have missed so much time that, frankly, we have prioritized them for new buildings because their situation is so bad. And there is active worry on the table about whether we're going to make it in time to get those buildings replaced, because our flagship schools, which offer incredible education, Poly is the highest ranked STEM school in the city, outperforming all the private schools. So if you're investing in private schools, you might consider a different option. And City is the regional record holder for IB diplomas in the region. So yeah, City is the regional record holder, outperforming Montgomery County and other IB schools that serve the creme de la creme of very wealthy districts. They serve up more IB diplomas than those schools in the conditions that we're talking about here today. And then Alicia was part of this team that came in after the January 2018 to help us think about how we could do better in investing the resources that we have. And not Alicia's team, but there were members of the private, the developer team who came to help us, who had been active in social media during the January 2018 winter about wondering what had like our governor, wondering what we had done with all the money and why we hadn't invested it more effectively, who then helped us, really got under the hood of the Pinto. It was a little rusty and hard to open, but they did get under it with us to look at what we were doing and how to make it better. And to a person, that group walked away with the just floored by the efficacy of what we do with the resources that we have. So we really, that's why you see those lifespans on those buildings. We have made those buildings work as much as they possibly can. Our team, Chief Lynette Washington and her team is incredible at really trying to figure out how to patch and make systems work as best as they possibly can for students, but it's not good enough. And so that's why you see, like January 2018, that was 2 weeks of sustained cold below zero. And so our buildings are a lot like communities that haven't been invested in, or families that are living on the edge of poverty. You can cobble it together and we can make them kind of work okay, but something like that, it just push them over. They can't function in that kind of cold. They can't really function on a reasonable day, but something like that, they just can't. It's the disinvestment over generations is way too much. They can't make it work. So in the strategic investment, one thing that we have to do in order to make all this work, so that gap that Josh talked about, and as he said, that's not just 1 year of a gap of funding, that's over 40 years. There is a lot of estimates that based on industry standards for the square footage that we have for our maintenance and for our investment, we should be getting about $350 million a year, and all combined, we have about $80 million, and that's been for the last at least 40 years. And so that cumulative effect on our buildings is it's really difficult. So we try to be really strategic with what the resources that we have and what we do. So in addition to being really good at fixing things and making them work longer than they should, we also, things like our 21st Century Buildings Plan, which we pay for, by the way, that comes out of students' classrooms. We pay $20 million a year, every year for the next now 35 years to pay for that. And it was necessary. We didn't really have any choice to do that, and it's wonderful for those buildings. And those buildings are in neighborhoods that have been disinvested in for generations. So they're neighborhoods that were redlined. They're neighborhoods where we've seen enrollment declines because of the disinvestment that has happened, for many, many, many generations. And we reasoned that those were the schools where we needed neighborhoods where we needed to close schools because of that disinvestment and the loss in enrollment, and that we need to combine schools. So we reasoned that if your school was closing, you should get first dibs on a new building. So that's where you see, if you drive around Baltimore and you look at the 24 buildings that we've cut ribbons on already, those are in Cherry Hill, they're in Park Heights, they're in neighborhoods where we really need to make investments. And so that's one way we do it. We also partner with philanthropic partners to make investments in the neighborhoods where we see that kind of disinvestment. So I was thinking of Sandtown for that. So like Heart of America is a partner who does beautification projects. So when we closed a school in Sandtown, Winchester, and combined them, we didn't have any more 21st century buildings to offer, but we did bring in partners to beautify that building to make it better for the students who were going there. But again, that's just not enough. The impact on the students is profound. So there's the lost time that Josh talked about. I really appreciate the Nobody Asked Me campaign and the talking to our students, because it is true that nobody does ask them, and they know. about these buildings. I like to tell a story about one of our students from Western. I don't know if we have any Western grads here, but the Western Doves are very vocal when we're not doing right by them in terms of their whatever is happening in their education, and I appreciate them for that. And so they, a few years back, were very vocal about the conditions of their building. And Western, again, this is one of the buildings, Western Poly lost, I don't know, maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks of school this year for lack of heat. And so they've been very vocal about that. And one summer we had an intern through the YouthWorks program, a little plug for YouthWorks. The YouthWorks program, we had a intern who was from Western. I think she was going into her sophomore year. And we took her, it was when we were working on the Sandtown Winchester project to invest there, and went with Heart of America to meet with potential contractors. They bring in outside groups to invest in the building. And so I was going to talk about why this was important, and again, why we were investing in that school. It's because it wasn't absorbing students from a closing school. That's why we wanted the investment there. So we went to talk about it, and our intern came with us. And so we walked the building and talked about where we were going to do improvements to it. And on the way home from that visit, she talked about the fact that she was so grateful that she got to go, because she had always felt that the reason that Western was in the condition it was in is because we didn't care about her, that we didn't feel that her education was important, and that when she went to Sandtown Winchester and she saw the conditions of that building, and she saw what we were doing to bring in outside investment, she realized that we were being very strategic, that we didn't have the resources we needed, and that we were being strategic about putting them in the schools that needed the investment, and that she had never seen a school like that, and that now she understands why Western wasn't getting the investment, because there are other schools that were in worse condition. And students shouldn't have to own that. They shouldn't have to bear that burden. They shouldn't be the ones deciding and having to realize that while their situation is bad, it could be worse, and that other students have it worse. That's a level of maturity that she shouldn't have to have. We should be making decisions to make sure that all of our students have what they need. I, again, can't say enough about how appreciative I am of this work, and to help us tell our story. And we've been telling the story to the state for many years, and are part of a lawsuit against the state for the inadequacy of the funding that they provide us. And so this type of information to really quantify what our students feel every day and what communicates to them their value is really important. So just really appreciate all the work.
Thank you, Allison. And I want to say they gave us 7 minutes, so I want to allow for you to ask questions, but I have one to start us off. And the one thing I think about is that so much of the work that you all do is what I call shadow work, right? You get to see the news report, but you don't realize all of the things that are embedded in that. And then you look at the great work that you've done, Josh, and your team, in helping to illuminate. What are the things that we, sitting here in this audience, ingesting this today, what are one or two things that you would say are action items for us to do based on what we've witnessed? I'll start with Allison and then Josh.
I think, is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah, mine.
Okay. I think one action item is continue to help tell this story and help make the case at the state. The state, that disparity that Josh showed about the investment or the tax base for different jurisdictions. Cities are the way they are for a reason. We all have valued that cities should have proximity for businesses and for all of us to the things that we need. So courthouses, universities, hospitals, all those government buildings, all those things are concentrated in cities. And so we think about Baltimore as having a low tax base because it's poor. sure, there are some low property tax areas in Baltimore. But the big issue is that we have all the universities. We're sitting in one right now. We have the hospitals. We have the nonprofits. We have the foundation. We have the government. None of those entities pay taxes. And so there's no tax base here. And so if we as society want to have cities that we can live in where people can work and bring business together, it is the state's job to make up for that gap. That's their job. And they're not doing their job. And so we're not going to Annapolis with a tin cup, as Dr. Santelises always says. We're not going asking for a favor. We are asking for what is the state's responsibility to provide the children in Baltimore City. And so helping make that case is really important, and helping people understand the story. It's really challenging. Our legislature, our delegation to the state legislature is really helpful to us, and they spend a lot of time defending Baltimore from attacks about how we're always taking the handouts. And again, these are not handouts. This is the way the state was structured intentionally. And so this is the job of the state to make up that gap, and they're just not doing it and haven't been doing it for years.
Thanks. I would just say that this really is the first time the state has been presented, because it's taken a couple months to really pull it together. We had 60,000 lines of data from these inspections to kind of sort through, and many electrons died so you could see that presentation. But we have to now turn that. I mean, data, it's just a slide set until it turns into a change. And so we are now in the process of taking that and developing a very specific agenda as we understand how the state is going to go about prioritizing schools, for example, for additional funds, as well as the more general discussion of school funding that Allison just talked to. So I think it's good for people to be aware of where this is heading and be alert for the next stages of this as we build hopefully what will be a opportunity to bring together the voices of students, the data of what's happening, and an agenda for specific change.
Is there one question from the audience? Billy.
So there are mics on the side of the room.
Oh, I don't need a mic. Yeah.
Billy doesn't.
Billy doesn't need a mic.
I heard you like briefly explain this on a call. To see this presentation is just jaw dropping. Yeah. And for me, what is hitting me is it's not okay to talk light. They need to take responsibility for publishing this kind of misinformation. And so part of where I'm like boiling over here, because you are right, to make change, we have to talk about it. Can we get it packaged? Can we get it in the hands? I want my stakeholders to have it, because at the highest level, it's not okay for the IAC to publish this. And then I guess the question for you is, has this been presented, and what was the response? Is there talk about adjusting how they're sharing this information? Because all it's going to do is perpetuate. The longer that first slide circulates, they knew that that was not right in the very onset. So is this a political agenda? What is this? And what has been the response as a result of your fantastic work? I mean, I salute you for really being a true partner and bringing this to life.
Thank you very much. And again, big team effort here, including your input at that earlier meeting. I would say that on the agenda is going to be meeting with the IAC itself, so that hasn't happened yet. Presenting to the Baltimore City delegation, which hasn't happened yet. We've had some preliminary conversations with some of the legislators who are aware of some of this, but this full presentation, you all are the first to see it, frankly. And as well as meeting with the state auditors, which I'll be doing in the next couple weeks. So there's going to be a lot of activity over the next month or two, I think, and hopefully that will gel. And I absolutely agree with you, getting this into different formats. So hopefully we'll have a very clear handout, a report with some of this information. We're going to, we have had a website, which we're going to update. That the Johns Hopkins GovX team helped us put together last year. We're going to put all this information up there so people can see it. So, and we will be available to present to any group, anyone here is interested in, to talk about it, so that people in Baltimore can really become familiar with it. We're, all this is going to sort of unfold I think particularly as the kind of agenda for specific requests gels, I think it'll be really important for people to see the data, the current status with the state, and what needs to happen all in one package.
How soon will you be ready to present?
I think all of that is, I mean, look, I can present this anytime, right? So I'm happy to do that. I think it's probably going to be over the next month or two that some of the more specific asks are going to come together.
Billy's already booked. I'm his booking agent, so I'll book him for you anytime you need. Yes, ma'am.
It's Murray Alexander. I'm his grandmother. This is Thomas Bell.
Excuse me, Elizabeth, I'm sorry. Can I ask you guys to use the mic because the folks at home can't hear the question?
Oh, sure. Then maybe this mic.
As I said, Murray Alexander, that's my grandson. He goes to the Baltimore Design School. When you do that, it was one particular graph you did when you was talking about the state's investment. If you could break that further down, because a lot of us in the community want to understand that stadium authority money. You mentioned everything, Allison, but you didn't mention the Ravens and the Orioles. That's a lot of money that comes into this city, and in addition to the casinos and the lotteries. Way back when, because I've been here since '64, they lied to us and said that, you know, the school's gonna get more money if you approve a lottery, or the school's gonna get more money if you approve a casino. So when you do that money, I wanna know how much of that money is coming from the Stadium Authority and how much of it is coming to Baltimore City. So when you break it down to red and blue, that still distorts things. You understand what I'm saying? So if you can do that graph over for me, I really would appreciate that, because I want to know the specific money that goes into the Stadium Authority from various means, and how much of that specific money is going to specific school districts. Thank you.
Thank you.
No comment?
Oh. I want to know the answers to that too. I thought those are great questions. And like I said, we're just scratching the surface of understanding the funding aspects to this. So I think it's totally fair questions, and I hope we can get the answers.
Let me just check and see. Go ahead to the mic before they stop us. We got one more minute, and I want to give one chance. We do have.
We have a commissioner, our school commissioner here is Commissioner Darrell Brooks is here, so I just wanted to acknowledge Commissioner Brooks and his work as a volunteer on the Baltimore City School Board to help us shepherd our work.
Okay, so really quickly, my name is Juan Wiggins, mentor and adult relationship specialist with Baltimore City Public Schools. My question is, have you all considered how gentrification factors into the equation, as well as the historical status of many Baltimore City public school buildings?
Gentrification and the historical status.
Yeah, so I mean, again, we have really focused on the way that we make our investments is by looking at where we're seeing our biggest investments is looking at where we're seeing the disinvestment over time. And so those are neighborhoods that we aren't really seeing gentrification yet. They're neighborhoods where there has been loss in enrollment. And Baltimore City, most of our buildings are built in the 70s or earlier. And so that was the population of Baltimore City was very different at that time. And so we've had to make a lot of hard decisions to close schools, which nobody wants to do. And so when we do, we really try to make sure that we are investing in the receiving school in significant ways. So in the 21st Century Buildings Plan, in the buildings, when we're out of that money, which we don't have any space to do that right now, then we do it with partnerships. We also do critical things like the way we bring the two communities together to select the principal, to select the name. There's a lot of loss in the names. The historical names that we're closing are often of important local leaders or African American leaders, so we make sure we work with the two communities to pick naming and pick programming. And so we haven't really seen our investments are really focused in those areas where we still see the enrollment decline, where we're not seeing the gentrification yet. So I don't know if that answers your question.
And thank you for that. Let me just say, you both have done
Sorry, we stole your microphone.
For the folks at home, sorry about that. Both of you have done an amazing presentation, and we all appreciate it. Would you join me in giving them a round of applause for this presentation? And I know Allison has to run, and Josh, you may not have to run, but You have to, you'll be here for a bit. Great. So I am cutting into your break, but you have a break, and there's I've been cooking all night, so there's food in the next room. If you don't like something, that wasn't my best work. But thank you all, and we will come back at 11 o'clock to transition to the next panel. But thank you all.